To liberate all sentient beings as infinite as space, please give rise to the supreme and precious bodhicitta. Now I will explain the Heart Sutra, empowered by Shakyamuni Buddha and spoken by Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva. In explaining this classic text, according to the interpretive methods of Tibetan Buddhism, the structural outline can be divided as follows. The entire sutra is divided into 3 sections. First, the nidana, or the causes and conditions of the sutra's origin. The second section discerns the actual meaning of the sutra's teachings. The third section focuses on rejoicing and praise. The origin is discussed from 2 perspectives. The first is the teaching on the 6 perfections. What we discussed yesterday falls under the explanation of these 6 perfections. The 6 perfections include the perfection of place, the perfection of the teacher, the perfection of the retinue, the perfection of the compiler, as well as the perfection of time, and the perfection of the Dharma. Yesterday we covered all 6 of these perfections. Generally speaking, most sutras possess these 6 perfections, or at least 5 of them. This is because the compiler is not always explicitly mentioned in every sutra. However, the other 5 are essentially always present. Therefore, when teaching the Tantric Great Net of Illusion or other Tantric scriptures, these 5 perfections are never absent. These 5 must always be explained. As for the 6 perfections, we finished that topic yesterday. Today we turn to the second aspect of the origin, the specific causes and conditions for teaching this sutra. In other words, from what causes did this particular sutra arise? As I mentioned yesterday, originally this commentary was to be based on Master Xuanzang's translation, but to give students a complete and perfect understanding of this sutra, I have supplemented it with some additional content. The supplements include the traditional Tibetan versions, various Han Chinese versions, and several extended versions of the Heart Sutra. I've used these to provide a fuller picture. Yesterday we covered Thus Have I Heard, and how the Buddha was staying at Vulture Peak in Rajgir, together with a great assembly of monks and a great assembly of bodhisattvas. We reached that point yesterday. Today most of you should have the text. While there might be slight variations in wording or style, slightly different here and there, they are essentially the same. For most parts they are identical. Today I will teach based on the Tibetan translation to explain to you the meaning of the Heart of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. At that time the Blessed One and others entered into the Samādhi of profound clarity, a gateway to the Dharma of various aspects. There arose such a dependent origination when the teacher, the retinue, the Dharma, and all other conditions were perfectly gathered. At that moment the Blessed One entered a Samādhi, abiding in a state of meditative absorption. The Blessed One, as you know, was Shakyamuni Buddha at that time. The word "and others" in the middle can be omitted. The meaning is that the Buddha then entered a state of meditative equipoise. What kind of equipoise? The equipoise of profound clarity. Why is it called profound? Because ordinary arhats, ordinary people, or those of other traditions cannot comprehend it at all. It is free from all elaborations, free from all effort and conceptual thought. The nature of all phenomena is extremely profound, hence it is called profound. As for clarity, this profoundly deep state is, before the individually self-cognizing wisdom of the Buddha, perceived clearly and completely, fully illuminated without obstruction. So this meditative equipoise is both profound and luminous. At that time he dwelt in a state of profound and luminous equipoise. The phrase gateway to the Dharma of various aspects here refers in fact to an equipoise, encompassing the many different aspects of the Dharma. You may refer to this later in several of the following teaching notes, where it is explained that gateway to the Dharma of various aspects points to the 5 aggregates being empty, 18 elements, the 12 ayatanas, and so forth, all the different gateways of the Buddha's teaching, all of which on the ultimate level are free from all conceptual elaboration, and on the conventional level are like illusions and like dreams. The Buddha had already entered such an equipoise. So in terms of the literal explanation, it should be clear, while all the retinue and the Buddha were present, the Buddha at that moment entered into this Samādhi of profound luminosity, an absorption encompassing the various gateways of the Dharma. While the Buddha was in this state of equipoise, we should also understand that for a Buddha, there is no difference between being in or out of meditation. From the perspective of the Buddha's own state, arising from and entering meditation are non-dual. So why does the text say entered meditation? This is a manifestation for the sake of the beings to be tamed. Sometimes the Buddha's form body displays the appearance of entering meditation. Therefore, for the sake of ordinary beings, this act of entering meditation is shown before us. In reality, there is no difference in the Buddha's equipoise. It should be understood this way. The text continues. The Bodhisattva Mahasattva Avalokiteshvara, while practicing the profound Prajna Paramita, that is, while the Buddha was in meditation, the great Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara was practicing the profound Prajna Paramita. He then observed and perceived that the 5 aggregates are empty. Here, between observed and perceived, omitting observed is also fine. It is consistent with the earlier translation to simply say perceived that the 5 aggregates are all empty. It means that while the entire retinue was present, Shakyamuni Buddha had already entered the profound and luminous equipoise. At that moment, Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva also practiced the Prajna Paramita. Avalokiteshvara is a Mahasattva. Generally, only those on the pure bhumis are called Bodhisattva Mahasattvas. Those from the first bhumi upward are true Bodhisattvas. As explained in Entering the Middle Way, Mahasattva means great Bodhisattva. What exactly defines a Mahasattva? Generally, those on the 3 pure bhumis, the 8th, 9th and 10th, are called Mahasattvas. Why is that the case? It is because bodhisattvas on these levels possess vast generosity, vast wisdom, vast capabilities and vast power. They have entered the vast Mahayana gateways and can subdue great Maras. They can overcome all kinds of obstacles. According to relevant treatises, the term great is used for these very reasons. So the text notes that among all those in the retinue, at that particular moment, Avalokiteshvara was practicing the Prajna Paramita. This practice has several layers of meaning. For instance, practicing the Prajna Paramita can be viewed broadly. Reading the Heart Sutra today is a form of practicing the Prajna Paramita. Listening to the Prajna Paramita today is also practicing Prajna. In the 5 treatises of Maitreya, 10 types of Dharma practices are mentioned, which include reciting, chanting, upholding, listening, writing, meditating, contemplating, and so forth. These are the 10 Dharma practices. When we take Prajna as the object and engage with it through these 10 practices, that is fundamentally what we call practicing the perfection of wisdom. What was Avalokiteshvara's practice at that time? It was abiding in realization. As the Buddha was absorbed in that state of profound luminosity, Avalokiteshvara, the Mahasattva, also used his own wisdom to follow the Buddha into that same state of wisdom. Now, according to the great Indian commentaries, when explaining Prajna and Paramita, wisdom is described through 3 metaphors: the Prajna sword, the Prajna vajra, and the Prajna lamp. Paramita is explained via the mundane, the supramundane, and the state that transcends all Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Those are the 3 explanatory aspects. Regarding these details, you can refer to the detailed commentary later, as the materials I'm sharing with you today include that specific method of interpretation. This is quite common in the more extensive Tibetan and Indian commentaries. What does this mean? While the Buddha was in meditation, Avalokiteshvara was also practicing within the state of the emptiness of Prajna Paramita. He was meditating in this way. At that moment, he perceived that the 5 aggregates are empty. The physical world and the world of sentient beings, all phenomena are contained within the 5 aggregates. In a single flash, Avalokiteshvara perceived this emptiness. He instantly realized that the 5 aggregates are all empty. Of course, there are different ways of perceiving. Generally, there is the perceiving of an ordinary person, the perceiving of the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, and the perceiving of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. As ordinary people, our perceiving is based on seeing general characteristics. For example, when we see that the 5 aggregates are empty, we might just be using logic to infer or analyze. We see it merely through conceptual thought. In truth, we haven't actually seen emptiness directly. When Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddha see the emptiness of the 5 aggregates, they see them as the causes and conditions of suffering. They then realize this emptiness through the selflessness of the person. But Bodhisattvas and Buddhas perceive it fully. They perceive the emptiness of the 5 aggregates through both the selflessness of phenomena and of the person. Their realization is perfectly complete. This covers the causes and conditions. Why do I call them that? Because we must ask, on what causes and conditions did this sutra rely to appear? The Buddha entering meditation is the primary condition. Had the Buddha not entered meditation and hadn't performed this observation, Avalokiteshvara would not have received the empowerment, nor been able to enter that Samādhi himself. Likewise, Shariputra would not have been able to ask his question. Thus, many ancient and great Indian commentaries state that these two factors are the conditions for the sutra's emergence. What are the main conditions for its appearance? One is the power of the Buddha's meditative blessing. It is inseparable. The second factor is that through the Buddha's blessing, Avalokiteshvara was also practicing the Prajna paramita, and in that process he perceived that the 5 aggregates are empty. Now some people ask, out of so many in the assembly, whether it was 77,000 or even 1,000,000 bodhisattvas, why was Avalokiteshvara the central figure here? Some masters explain that Avalokiteshvara was effectively the host or the primary organizer of that assembly. At that particular gathering, he was the key person in charge, so that's why Shariputra addressed his question to him. On the surface, this gathering of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas really is like the Dharma assemblies held today. There are central and secondary roles, the teaching master, the moderator, and various eminent monks and scholars. There are those who take the lead, and it was just like that back then. Among the entire retinue before the Buddha, there were indeed key disciples who appeared frequently, such as Maudgalyana, Shariputra, and Manjushri. So there really is a distinction of roles. That's one valid way to explain it. Alternatively, because this sutra is inseparable from the union of compassion and emptiness, and because if Avalokiteshvara spoke it, countless sentient beings would benefit, the Buddha perceived this perfectly through his supernormal powers. He then specifically empowered Avalokiteshvara to practice the perfection of wisdom. While Avalokiteshvara perceived that the aggregates are empty, it was also through the Buddha's blessing that Shariputra did not ask the Buddha directly, since he was in meditation, nor did he ask Manjushri Vajrapani or others. Instead, he felt a strong urge to ask Avalokiteshvara. This question too was prompted by the Buddha's power. So sometimes things unfold through such conditions. The questions many of you raised yesterday were excellent. When you feel something isn't quite right, you should ask. By asking, you can often clear up your doubts. Once those doubts are gone, you won't be troubled or confused by the sutras and treatises. I believe this is very important. Everyone should understand that in the Heart Sutra there are 2 main figures. One is the Buddha. At the very end, the Buddha says, well said, Avalokiteshvara, excellent, you have spoken wonderfully. He only said this one thing. Aside from that, throughout this entire sutra, he does not speak at all. The Buddha remains silent. This sutra was spoken entirely by Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, while Shariputra raised questions in the middle. Therefore, in the Heart Sutra, there are 3 main figures. To put it in modern terms, first there is the Buddha. Empowered by the Buddha's meditative absorption, Avalokiteshvara was practicing the profound Prajna paramita. At that moment, Shariputra, some versions say he asked with palms joined, others do not mention it. Regardless of whether he joined his palms, Shariputra addressed his questions to Avalokiteshvara. Once the questions were asked, Avalokiteshvara explained the entire Heart Sutra, including the ground, path, and fruition. He laid it all out. What was just discussed, according to the outlines of many commentaries, can be divided into the 6 perfections in the first part and the dependent origination in the latter part. You could also say it's about causes and conditions. In Xuanzang's translation, it simply says, Avalokiteshvara was practicing Prajna paramita. Logically, it starts with the Buddha entering meditation, and while practicing the profound Prajna paramita, Avalokiteshvara clearly perceived that the 5 aggregates are empty and thus cross beyond all suffering and adversity. In the Tibetan version, the phrase cross beyond all suffering and adversity does not appear. However, it is present in the version translated from the Indian source. It exists in the extended versions from India. It is also found in translations by Xuanzang and Kumarajiva. Some argue that because it's not in the Tibetan, Xuanzang must have been mistaken. As I mentioned yesterday, some scholars use this reason to challenge Xuanzang's version, but such a challenge is likely invalid. Absence in Tibetan doesn't prove it wasn't original. If so many versions contain it, it's simply a matter of different editions. Furthermore, when the Buddha taught, every person heard something different. For example, when the Buddha turned the wheel of Dharma on Vulture Peak, there were 100,000 disciples. Each possessed unfailing dharani, yet the teachings they each received were not identical. So it was not like today where when people take records, some find their recorders broken or others find their pens failed. It wasn't like that. At that time, for the disciples who preferred a concise version, they received and upheld the brief teachings. Meanwhile, those who preferred detailed teachings remembered the extensive version. Thus, when the Buddha spoke a single sentence, some in the audience heard an elaborate teaching, while others heard a condensed one. This is a unique quality of the Buddha. I think in the future we might encounter many situations. Much like the Infinite Life Sutra we discussed yesterday, the moment we see some content, we might think, oh, this is different from that, it should be corrected. Once when we were printing the Heart Sutra elsewhere, it was very short, and we gave a copy to everyone. A university professor said, there are 2 instances of the word is here. Should I change it? I began to strictly rebuke him, saying, your wisdom cannot possibly exceed Master Xuanzang's. Forget it, don't say such things. Just being a university teacher is nothing extraordinary. You must never alter the scriptures. He said there is an is here and another is there. Should I edit them to make the text flow better? Indeed, some worldly people are like this nowadays. We might be the same if we haven't received a systematic Buddhist education. It is very likely that later on, when we read the sutras, we'll feel that it doesn't flow here or it's awkward there. But to change them casually is certainly wrong. Even if some parts seem missing or incomplete, the blessing remains inconceivable. We've mentioned this before. The mantra is meant to be Om Vajra Kili Kilaya Hum Fat. However, someone mispronounced it. He was chanting Om Vajra Kili Kilaya Hum Fat. Yet while he chanted Gili Kilaya, the mountains, rivers and the entire earth chanted along with this yogi in unison. But when another person tried to correct his mantra, all those other sounds suddenly stopped. Even though Gili Kilaya is not found in other mantras, his own heart was pure. Empowered by inconceivable strength, it had already become a true mantra. In this way, take for example, overcoming all suffering in Xuanzang's version. Perhaps it really was missing in the Tibetan version, but it has already been blessed by the author. If we use our conceptual thoughts to add or subtract from the text, we lose the blessing power of the entire sutra. Therefore, many young people, when propagating the Dharma in the future, may encounter various situations. Under such circumstances, you must maintain your own right view. Do not be easily swayed by the opinions of worldly people, nor casually alter the Vajra speech of the sutras. That would be inappropriate. So we have already introduced the background of the first point. Now for the second point, determining the meaning of this sutra. In the outline, it's called determining the meaning. This is divided into 2 parts. The first part is determining through questions and answers. This again is split into 2, raising the question and giving the answer. First, raising the question. The text of the sutra goes like this. Then, the Venerable Shariputra, empowered by the Buddha, addressed the noble Avalokiteshvara, Bodhisattva, Mahasattva. If a son of noble family wishes to practice the profound Prajna paramita, how should he train? For some of the text, Prajna and Leon have a slightly better translation, as I mentioned regarding this inquiry. While the entire assembly was present, the Buddha had already entered Samādhi. Avalokiteshvara was practicing the Prajna paramita and perceived that the 5 aggregates are empty. This means he had achieved certainty. While practicing the Prajna paramita, he realized the truth that all 5 aggregates are empty. If one hasn't realized it oneself, there is no grounds to teach others. Therefore, when we are teaching the Dharma, especially explaining the sutras, we must be very careful. In ancient India, apart from Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti and a very few other Panditas, generally speaking, it was very rare to explain the sutras based solely on one's own intellect. Of course, there are many masters who explain the sutras using their wisdom. When we examine them, some are indeed quite remarkable, and we wouldn't dare criticize. But some can't even explain the literal meaning. They just casually read through the scripture and start talking about worldly matters, where they've traveled, what they ate, or their life before ordaining eating seafood, and so on. Once they finish chatting, they consider the verse fully explained. This way of teaching the sutras simply does not exist in the tradition. Admittedly, in some places, this tradition and oral transmission have been lost. Without the transmission, they think it's like giving a lecture in school, casually explaining the sutras using their own conceptual ideas. That leads to significant discrepancies. So when we explain the sutras in the future, we should try to integrate the teachings of great masters. If these teachings are unavailable, one must generally be very cautious. Otherwise, failing to explain the Buddha's scriptures correctly carries a heavy karmic burden. It is a great fault. Of course, you might have the best intentions to explain it well, and your understanding may indeed be correct. However, during the process, you might inadvertently say something that doesn't align with the sutra's meaning. In that case, the fault is not so great, since you didn't misinterpret it on purpose. So we must be very mindful of this. Just as Avalokiteshvara perceived the 5 aggregates as empty, at that very moment, the Venerable Shariputra spoke. Venerable is a common form of address. It appears frequently in the sutras. It's like when we say great abbot, elder, or one of long life. It carries that meaning. It is a title of great respect. At that time, the Venerable Shariputra, now Shariputra, appeared as a Shravaka Arhat, but many Shastras and Sutras tell us that he was a Mahayana Bodhisattva. Generally, while he manifested in the form of a Shravaka Arhat, he was actually a great Bodhisattva. As for the origin of the name Shariputra, it's because his mother was named Shari. So people called him Shariputra, Shariputra. He is the son of Shari, hence the name Shariputra. This kind of naming convention is also very common in Tibetan areas. In childhood, people often use the father's name or the mother's name to refer to someone. It happens quite a bit. I almost went by my father's name myself. When I was young, many people would use my father's name to call me son of so-and-so, and I would get quite angry. I clearly had my own name, so why call me by my father's name? Later on, it seemed to stop. But India has this tradition. Now, Shariputra spoke empowered by the Buddha. Why do we say that? Because from a conventional standpoint, even for a great Shravaka Arhat, asking such a question would be impossible without the Buddha's blessing. Therefore, he received the Buddha's blessing and power. Only with the Buddha's blessing and power could he ask this question regarding the profound Prajna and the nature of emptiness. He addressed the noble Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva Mahasattva. He then raised this question to the great Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. It could only be asked through the Buddha's blessing. In general, to pose such a profound question, one cannot do without the Buddha's blessing. We often say this in daily life too, right? The question you asked today is excellent. Normally I wouldn't be able to come up with it. It must be due to your noble blessing, which is why the question I asked today turned out so well. Even in the worldly realm, this kind of thing happens. So why did Shariputra ask such a great question? Because the Buddha blessed him. The Buddha blessed him through being in meditative absorption, not through any other means. At that time, he asked noble Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, if a son of noble family, in some versions it says son of noble family, is used to address Avalokiteshvara. It reads, son of noble family, if one wishes to practice Prajna Paramita, how should he do it? That is one interpretation. But one commentary points out that addressing Avalokiteshvara as son of noble family, that is, for Shariputra to call him son of noble family, might seem a bit disrespectful. Therefore, some masters do not accept this. I've seen some Chinese translations like the one by Prajna and others, where it says, son of noble family. If any practitioner wishes to learn the profound Prajna Paramita, how should he practice? It is phrased like that there as well. However, some Tibetan commentaries have refuted this, explaining that he was asking Avalokiteshvara if there is a son or daughter of noble family. Of course, the daughter of noble family is omitted here. That's another way to explain it. Anyway, both interpretations exist and either is fine. Addressing Avalokiteshvara as son of noble family won't make him angry, right? Because he is indeed a noble being. Though in the Han Buddhist tradition, Avalokiteshvara sometimes manifests in female form. If Avalokiteshvara were a female to begin with, she might not be happy being called a son. If a son of noble family wishes to practice the profound Prajna Paramita, how should he train? The question is, if any man or woman in the world truly wishes to practice the Prajna Paramita, how exactly should they go about it? This was the question Shariputra posed. Noble Avalokiteshvara, you are truly remarkable. Relying on the Buddha's power of blessing, you have already perceived that the 5 aggregates are empty. But for many of us poor sentient beings, practicing the Prajna Paramita seems so difficult. If we wish to practice the Prajna Paramita, how exactly should we go about it? Regarding this Prajna emptiness, how should we practice? When this question was posed, empowered by the Buddha's blessing, Avalokiteshvara then expounded the entire teaching that follows. So this part is categorized under raising the inquiry. Next, we move to the second part of the outline, the answer, the response given to him. The answer is elaborated through 6 aspects. First, a brief explanation on how to practice Prajna. Second, a detailed explanation on the essence of Prajna. Within this detailed explanation, nearly all key contents are covered. Third, the merits of realizing emptiness. Fourth, the state of fruition of realizing Prajna emptiness. Fifth, proclaiming the mantra that possesses great merit. Sixth, the exhortation to train in the Dharma gate of Prajna. So the outline is divided into these 6 parts. Now for the first point, today we can just cover the brief explanation. Avalokiteshvara replied in this way, as I read in Xuanzang's translation. When Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva was practicing the profound Prajna Paramita, he perceived that all 5 aggregates are empty. Just now the Buddha had entered Samādhi, and Avalokiteshvara was also practicing the Prajna Paramita. At that time he perceived that the 5 aggregates are empty, overcoming all suffering, transcending all the suffering within the 3 realms of samsara. Actually, according to some scriptures, Avalokiteshvara had attained Buddhahood long ago. Moreover, in countless worlds, he liberates sentient beings in the form of a Buddha. Yet he also manifests as a Bodhisattva before Shakyamuni Buddha to benefit beings. This is the fundamental view in definitive sutras. That's how it is. So Avalokiteshvara, relying on the Buddha's power and blessing while practicing the Prajna Paramita, perceived that the 5 aggregates are empty. All suffering of falling into the lower realms and the 6 paths of rebirth was completely eliminated. At this point in the brief explanation of the Tibetan text, we haven't reached form is not different from emptiness yet. In the Tibetan, that phrase belongs to the detailed explanation. When I have to jump to Xuanzang's version to explain things, all this running back and forth is a bit tiring. But when I speak, I hope you can understand it this way. When you recite it or practice it later, you can simply use Xuanzang's translation in its entirety. Just as I mentioned a while ago, this translation by Xuanzang indeed possesses incredible blessing power. Whether abroad or here in China, everyone is reciting this version. Sometimes I think Xuanzang's power of aspiration must be inconceivable, or maybe I wonder if the Han people just love status. Because Xuanzang held a very high position back then, the emperor personally revered him. In that case, would people accept him immediately, viewing him as the great imperial preceptor? We must read Xuanzang's Heart Sutra, and suddenly the entire nation starts reciting Xuanzang's version. The translations of all other masters are left unread. Could that be it? Since no one reads the versions by other Tang masters, but regardless of the reason, Xuanzang's contribution to the Buddhist world is truly immense. Thus, in many shastras, past masters often said that Xuanzang was Avalokiteshvara, Sun Wukong was Manjushri, and Jubaji was an emanation of Vajrapani. There is such a saying. In that case, he too is a manifestation of Avalokiteshvara. Saying it this way brings a sense of blessing. So when you recite it for your own practice, use this scripture for your chanting. But please do not alter it. At the same time, don't think that the Heart Sutra is simple. Some people with strong conceptual bias might think like this. I've heard people say, I'm writing my doctoral thesis now and it's tens of thousands of words. What's so great about the Heart Sutra? It's only 200 or so characters. Truly, people in the world today can be quite frightening sometimes. The arrogance they generate is quite something. On the surface, it's just a single page, but in reality, its merit, blessing, and power are incomparable. A piece of gold may be very small, but its value remains potent wherever it goes. In the same way, the sutras have their own power and blessing. Everyone should visualize this blessing. So after saying all that, Avalokiteshvara replied to the Venerable Shariputra. He said, if a son or daughter of noble family wishes to practice the profound Prajna Paramita, they should likewise view the 5 aggregates as empty. This is the brief explanation. Today we are discussing the brief method of practicing Prajna Paramita. He says that in this world, if one wants to meditate on the Prajna Paramita, then they should also meditate by seeing the 5 aggregates as empty. This is the summary. Now, why does the emptiness of the 5 aggregates encompass everything that follows? Because the emptiness of the 5 aggregates actually encompasses the world of environments and sentient beings, as well as the 12 sources, 18 elements, dependent origination, and the 4 noble truths. All of these are indirectly included within the teaching of the emptiness of the 5 aggregates. This is also explained in the relevant commentaries. Whether practicing the 6 perfections, the 4 means of attraction, or any other Dharma gate, all should be practiced by contemplating emptiness. So what does it mean to contemplate emptiness? In the ultimate sense, it means being free from all conceptual elaborations, a state beyond all language and mental constructs. That is how we should practice. In the relative sense, everything is like a dream, a phantasm, a bubble, or a shadow. Practice with this understanding. This is the most fundamental method for us to contemplate emptiness. Last year, we studied Mipham Rinpoche's commentary on the Middle Way. All the methods for contemplating the Prajna Paramita are like the sky in the ultimate sense, free from all attachments and conceptual elaborations. That is the way to practice. In the relative sense, practice by seeing things as appearing yet lacking inherent nature. One must understand the summary in this way. Why did the Buddha enter such a samadhi before this sutra could be revealed? It means that we as followers must truly meditate on the teaching of Prajna emptiness. Without meditation, realization is impossible. After finishing the explanation of the Heart Sutra, I would also like to talk about how to practice it. Because in Tibetan Buddhism, there are specific practices for the Heart Sutra. How do we practice the Heart Sutra? This practice is very important. If you don't understand the practice, even if you can recite it perfectly every day, you have never actually meditated on the Heart Sutra. If that's the case, I feel it is merely a matter of chanting. In reality, you haven't yet contemplated or truly practiced it. Therefore, look at the Heart Sutra and see if you are fulfilling the 10 Dharma activities. Activities like reciting, upholding, hearing, contemplating, and meditating. Are you practicing all of these? Some people, some practice centers or some monasteries only engage in chanting, reciting it in the morning or during evening prayers, but they never contemplate it, nor do they ever practice it. This will certainly not do. Such profound emptiness cannot be realized without practice. Of course, as someone who doesn't practice at all, it's quite laughable for me to say this to others, and it may not bring much benefit, but logically speaking, I understand it well. As a practitioner, encountering such an emptiness Dharma gate is extremely rare, even in millions of eons. Since we have encountered this teaching, we should try our best to let go of our inherent attachments, set aside some time to meditate on the content of the Heart Sutra. In this brief explanation, it applies to sons and daughters of noble family alike. Some masters explain that when it mentions sons and daughters of noble family, though barren women aren't explicitly mentioned, they are already included as part of humanity. In that case, sons and daughters of noble family refer to true human beings, which also indirectly includes all categories of people. All these individuals should practice the profound Prajna Paramita. As I mentioned earlier, how should one practice and train? It is by meditating on the truth that the 5 aggregates are empty, guided by the view of the emptiness of the 5 aggregates. This is what it means. For the view of the emptiness of the 5 aggregates, take for example the aggregate of form, perception, or consciousness. Realize them all as empty. At the level of ordinary beings, we understand this through conceptual thought. Once one realizes the selflessness of persons and phenomena, they have truly mastered the emptiness of personal and phenomenal selflessness. In this way, one perceives the 5 aggregates as empty, regardless, even while we are still ordinary beings. We should be guided by the view of the 5 aggregates' emptiness. This is by no means an impossible task. For instance, in our daily activities, whether practicing the Prajna Paramita, performing prostrations, or doing the preliminary practices, or even reciting the rebirth mantra, on the relative level, accumulating roots of virtue is like a dream or illusion. Yet it remains indispensable, but in the ultimate sense, everything is like the pure and stainless sky, entirely free from conceptual elaborations. When we are guided by this insight, throughout our daily lives, all attachments related to the 5 aggregates will gradually fade away. In short, we must sever the grasping itself. If this self-grasping is cut, then the 5 aggregates associated with it will naturally be pacified. Practicing in this manner is the basic meditation of the Heart Sutra. That is all for today. Tomorrow we will begin the detailed explanation.
Bandharangara Padma Sadardha Bandharangara Padma Sadardha Aham Bandhangara Padma Sodargye